Okay, so we want to begin looking at the Dante's Inferno text, and we're going to begin by just analyzing a few elements, and we're going to look at each canto and kind of talk about what's happening briefly in each canto to make sure that you're understanding as you read along. All right, so before we get right into the text, I need to introduce you to the ideas of hell in which Dante is thinking. Now, remember, Dante is thinking in a 14th century sort of classical Catholic way of looking at hell. So you have the belief of course, purgatory, hell itself, and then heaven sort of being the triple layer. However, you're going to see through this, Dante does explore his own sort of theological notions at times, and we'll talk about those as we get to them. Now, hell, of course, is a realm of the afterlife where unrepentant sinners dwell. The geography of hell could be thought of not just as a physical place, but also a moral place, sort of a moral geography in which successive concentric circles reveal the nature of even more serious sins. It's sort of like a tornadic activity. I'm sure you'll see pictures that remind you of a tornado when you look at Dante's Inferno. Now, the three large categories of moral failure that Dante deals with are incontinence, violence, and fraud, and they're represented as the inversion of the classical virtues, moderation, courage, and wisdom. He's met by the poet Virgil, who tells him that he must go by another route if he's to get out of his condition. That condition is one of moral ambiguity, a sort of lostness in his life. Dante is reluctant, but Virgil continues to tell him it's about its importance. So Dante does follow him. So once again, what do you need to remember? What do you need to be a member in Dante's afterlife? You simply need to be an unrepentant sinner who died before 1300. You could be real, fictional, doesn't matter. If you're an unrepentant sinner who died before 1300, then you can be a member in Dante's afterlife. Dante is on a journey to the center of the earth, and here's what we talk about through that tornadic ring. You can kind of see the rings as they go down. If you were to shift out, it would sort of go from broad to smaller. Dante is on a journey to the center of the earth. No one believed that the earth was flat. Okay, so this is physical, but it's also moral. As we journey towards the bottom of hell, where we will eventually meet Satan, each sin becomes more serious and severe, as well as the sinners. So the punishment is not something that's a little worse than the last, but it's rather a fitting punishment for the sin, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. The fact that Dante makes them unrepentant sinners suggests that he's also not concerned about the criminal justice system, but he's much more concerned with the question, what does it mean to be human? He's not concerned about the proper punishment. He's concerned about what does this tell us about humanity itself. Humans have an intellect and free will to choose. We'll notice that the sinners at the top of hell ignore those human qualities, and further down we see the perversion of those qualities. You'll see people who did exist and people who didn't, but are characters in mythology of literature. This helps establish both the universal concerns and the particular concerns related to Dante and Florence during his life. So what do all the sinners have in common? One, they are unrepentant, and two, they have an overwhelming compulsion to justify what they've done. They put the blame on others. Now, Dante as a character. Dante creates himself as a character who will mess up a lot. So we need to always be in reference to Dante the writer, but then Dante the character, because Dante the writer is, of course, looking back on everything that he's learned, he's thinking through things, but he creates a sort of, he takes away that preemptive knowledge from the character. Dante the character is ignorant of a lot of that knowledge, because Dante the writer is wanting to show us the process of coming to that knowledge, the process of learning it. So he's going to misunderstand a lot, Dante the character, and he's going to respond the wrong way. It's going to take him a while to get oriented. Even if as he begins to understand, he still has lapses of mistakes. Dante wants the reader to have the same experience as Dante the character. Okay, so he's wanting the reader to slowly come into the understanding as Dante the character does as well. It's very similar to as we read the Apostle of Mark and looked at that text as literature, how Mark, the writer, wants us to preemptively understand who he suggests this idea of a Messiah is, but then how that slowly comes to the fruition. And he does that through the ignorant understanding of the disciples and how they slowly begin to matriculate and understand who the Messiah or Jesus really is in that sense. That's what Mark his goal is as we look at that in a literature way. So why do so many people fall victim to these sins? Dante the poet not only talks about the ultimate destructiveness of the sin, but also the surface and veneer of the attractiveness that how that sin is attracted to people and how people think that the sin is going to be fun. Virgil tells us that after we actually get into the gate of hell, we have to be careful because here people have lost their intellect. And so, what he means by that is to lose the good of intellect is really what the whole Inferno is about. This idea of not being able to see things clearly. So, what people say is not necessarily the way Dante, the writer, feels. It's going through that understanding of what seems fun may not actually be good. What looks good may not actually be good for you. And what looks hard might actually not be as hard to do as we think. So in Canto 1, it starts in a dark wood. It's clear that Dante is disoriented. He can't tell us what it's like. He uses vague terms. He can't tell us how he got there. He's in this sort of condition of disorientation. He's basically woken up to a midlife crisis. If he was rich and modern, he probably would have bought a Ferrari to get himself out of there. But he hasn't done that because he's not rich. He's middle class and he's in the 1300s. So no Ferrari for Dante. This is a terrible position for him to be in. He can in no way define the sort of sense. You can sense the anxiety, the depression that he's feeling throughout this, a real sense of purposelessness. And that's really the focus of this beginning of Canto 1 and why he uses this sort of vague terminology. When Dante comes to, it's this epiphany. It's not as if he's just waking up and saying, oh, what's going on? I shouldn't have done that. This isn't who I set out to be. This is not what I wanted to do and what I love or claim to value. How did that happen and how did I get out of it? Right? He's not doing that. It's not this sudden, like, oh, boom, I'm there. He's slowly coming out of this process, and it's going to take a learning process to get through it. Some important lines that we want to talk about, of course, in line 3, there's this sort of biblical allusion to him going from the forest into the straight way. That, of course, is the allusion that Jesus says that he is the straight way, that he's the straight and narrow, that he's the way of life. So he talks about himself in line 11 as if he was full of sleep. This talks about his sort of moral oblivion. He's in that sense of ambiguousness. And then in line 20, he talks about when he feels this sudden sense of anxiety, he feels the blood going to the lake of his heart. So people didn't think that the heart was sort of this pump. They didn't think that the heart was the pump of what it is that we see in modern science. They thought of the heart as sort of the lake for blood, that the blood would sort of sit there, and blood was equated to pneuma or spirit. And so they thought of it as sort of this sort of lake that was there. And so when anxiety comes, when people get flushed, all that blood sort of runs quickly back into the lake, and it causes, yellowing of the skin, anxiety, and, that sort of depressive nature. He then, of course, in line 22, talks about laboring for breath right after the lake of the heart. And he writes in a language that appears that he's been shipwrecked on something. And this is, of course, a parallel to Aeneas from the Aeneid. Right away, he begins focusing on that sort of allusion as well. Now, we get to the beast. He sees these 3 beasts. There's this light out there, but he can't get by it because he's stopped by the 3 beasts. In Latin, they're all El Lanza, Leon, and Lupa, and I don't actually know if I said that correctly. We're just going to hope. The leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf, incontinence, perverted desire, violence, and fraud. So for some reason, people have talked about this for centuries, the she-wolf sort of stands out as the most volatile one. We don't really know why. It appears more focused and scary to Dante. Maybe it's what she stands for Dante's personal life. We're not sure. Later on, you have the idea of the Greyhound come in. So you have this sort of altar animal that comes in, and Greyhound is obviously, sort of a connection to the second coming of Christ, or in Dante sort of has this double tap belief. What we mean by that is it's sort of this double hill prediction or a double hill meaning. In other words, if you're looking and you're on a hill and you see two hills, they appear as one hill. If you look at them from the distance, they appear as one hill because you can't, they look equal to each other from the distance that you're looking at. So what we mean by that is Dante is looking at actually a few figures, but he's prescribing them all as the one here. So he actually probably is also talking about some of the, maybe a pope or something along that line. So anyway, you see that in lines 101 through 105. Line 111, the devil, it talks about the whole process of why the devil's here is envy, and that the reason that the devil fell from God, or became estrayed from what his purpose was for being, was that he envied man's preferred status to God as the reason for his enmity. So in other words, it's a really interesting concept theologically, maybe something that you might want to explore more on your own. But the idea that Satan somehow prefers or would prefer to be in the status that mankind is, and so he rebels against God because he's not in that status. In Canto 2, we're introduced to the Muses, which is very odd because as we've read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and looking at a few of these other epic pieces, they begin right away with sort of an invocation to the Muses. And here we see it actually coming in as in Canto 2, so that the appearance of an invocation in Canto 2 turns the entire first canto, which would be the 34th canto, because you got 34, 33, 33 in the 100 cantos. So maybe it's actually a propositio, and that's sort of the announcement of subject, sort of a prologue, if you will. And Dante doesn't just ask for the Muses for help; he also asks for wit, and he's asking his own mind, and along with the common lore of the Muses, to help him write this. Virgil breaks in and tells Dante he's here to save him, and that heaven gave him a mission to come save Dante. But Virgil is advising a different path than the light Dante's after. Dante is very reluctant to go with Virgil because Virgil insists that before Dante can go up, he must realize that the way of salvation is to go down. Dante suggests the words of Virgil are cruel, and it shows how disoriented Dante really is. Now, Silvius in Canto 2, that is the posthumous son of Aeneas, and it's also another parallel to the Aeneid. And Dante writes it in as historical fact. In fact, he really treats the entire Aeneid as a historical fact. And then he mentions Peter in lines 20 to 24. And this is the idea that the Romans were the second chosen people. This is not necessarily, and I don't actually know Dante's belief in this, but you have a lot of back and forth theological problem and processing with once Jesus comes along, who is the chosen people? Is Israel still chosen people? Or is that just the church now? And those that say it's only the church, we call that supersessionism, right? That it was sort of taken away, like Jesus has created the chosen people by all that would believe in him and sort of the church. That's the Christian ideal for some. Others think it's both Israel as the ethnic group, the Jews, and their belief system, and of course Christians as well, both, or anybody that is even beyond Christianity to also believe in this idea of who Jesus is. We're not sure where Dante sits in that. The Catholic belief is also very different in a lot of different places on their structural identity there with belief system. Dante, either way, does believe that the Romans are also a second chosen people. He believes in the system. He believes what they're doing. He believes that they are going to bring about the goodness of who God is. There's a real sense of nationalism there. but I don't think it's over exuberant. It's not America. It's more just, oh, we are going to be the peacemakers in the world. Um, Dante is surprised that Virgil has come to him in line 32. He says, hey, I'm not Aeneas or Paul. So it opens up the sense that this epic is going to be done by a layman, a person who's not Aeneas, who's not Paul, who's not chosen, but is still chosen, not based on their royal birth or based on, God picking them or something like that, but just chosen in the sense that they're in that place that they are. And then in lines 52 through 117, we see that Virgil was sent by Beatrice, who was sent by Lady Lucy, or Santa Lucia, and who was eventually also sent by Mother Mary, the actual Virgin Mary herself. So you see that there's this real strand of hierarchy going down in order to care and save Dante from where he is. All right, so we definitely want to talk about the gate inscription in Canto 3. I am the way into the city of woe. I am the way to a forsaken people. I am the way into eternal sorrow. Sacred justice moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence. Primordial love and ultimate intellect. Only those elements time cannot wear were made before me, and beyond time I stand. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So a couple of comments, and then we'll get into some further comments about this. I am the way. Obviously, this is a sort of oppositional, ironic tone. God makes it. God is the one who calls himself the I am. This gate is something eternal. It's something God created. It's also reflective of the opening into hell, whereas Jesus is the opening in the Christian or Catholic idea into heaven, Jesus being the way. So here's sort of the oppositional sense of who Jesus is. Not that this is an evil thing, it's just something that God created. It's the gate. So into the city of woe, obviously that's a similarity to the idea of the weeping and gnashing of teeth. I am the way to the forsaken people, very similar to what Jesus says on the cross. My Father, why have you forsaken me? I am the way into eternal sorrow. Sacred justice moved my architect, the idea of having to deal with the nature of evil, having to deal with that there is justice there and that God wants and promotes that justice. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, primordial love, and ultimate intellect. Obviously, a reference to God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You've got the Trinity there. Only those elements that time cannot wear. It could be a reflection of them. It could also be a reflection of like demons and angels and things like that. Were made before me in time I stand. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So that's a brief look at the inscription, what it means. Let's go into a few more details about it. Okay, so these inscriptions, the fact that it has an inscription, this is very normal for a gate to have at the time period, and they commonly stated the intent, the reason that the gate was being. Now, the reference to the city of woe, the idea of city. So, a couple things here. First of all, this is a reference to the fall of Jerusalem that happens after Jesus' death, 68, 72. I can't remember quite exactly AD. All through that process, the rebellion and the Romans having to take it over in the fall of Jerusalem, sort of the destruction of Jerusalem. It also is in reference to the sort of the opposite idea of what we see within Revelation, where God, see, a lot of people think of Revelation as sort of like, oh, what happens in heaven, but there's really a lot more focus on about what happens on earth, and there's this focus in creation on the New Jerusalem, and this New Jerusalem idea, this city that God creates here as a place of constant being for the people that are there. So we see sort of the opposite here, sort of an New Jerusalem in here by creating a grieving city, and also this is Augustine who really focuses on what the ideas of hell and heaven are as cities, as he does in his works called Cities of God. So there's a lot of reference and allusion to those, and then of course we see that the divine power is a reference to the Trinity as well. Now, in Canto 3, the first people that we meet in hell are the cowards, the neutrals. These are people that refuse to stand for anything both good and bad. So they show their selfishness by not taking stands, and in doing so, they begin losing parts of themselves. Dante's theory of hell is that people really get to experience their sinfulness, but without the veneer of looking as if it is fun, even though some will think that. This is another way for the poet to let us know that refusing to choose really is a choice. That the sense that you are not choosing is kind of an illusion. It's a scam that you play. Everything that you do is either furthers you one way or the other. Everything is a choice, even the act of not choosing. Um, there is this sort of unnamed figure that we see here in Canto 3. He talks about it, and that sort of it points to the idea of it being Pontius Pilate as sort of the general, just somebody who just stands aside to let bad things happen. But there's also this sort of particular idea that it's also Pope Clement V. Both of them are said to look at this. They're both named here, but they're named only in the indirect fashion because once again they've lost who they are. They're only talked about in vague terms. They're sort of translucent identities now. They're not themselves. Very similar to when you read anything in by Homer or Virgil about Hades. Sort of just they're a shadow, a wisp of their former selves. They seem to have this sense of anonymity in hell. The sense here is that refusing to choose sides is really a choice. He talks about Laodicea and talks about the idea of these people being lukewarm. And Dante would not have understood this then. This, however, is very important to correct. This comes from John's Apocrypha, or sorry, Apocalypse of the Revelation Apocalypse in the very last book of the New Testament. And this is he talks to 7 different churches, and it's the church of Laodicea that he talks about being lukewarm. And this is a pretty big deal because most of the time people say, oh, if you're lukewarm, if you're just half in or half out, and that's the way Dante even is talking about it here. That is, God is going to spit you out of the mouth. However, this is really not at all what that text is suggesting or saying, and I think it's worth thinking through here of seeing how Dante's Catholic point of view, and also has also come into the Reformed point of view as well, is really not correct to the text that it derives from. You see what happened in Laodicea. Laodicea was a huge area that had created, been part of the Roman system and had created ways to funnel and get clean water. And so they would create these huge viaducted sort of pipelines to get clean water into wells and things like that. But they made them out of limestone and other stones that the minerals from those stones would get into the water. So if the water was hot, it would be fine. And if the water was cold, it would be fine. It would not taste gross. But if the water was lukewarm, then you had a real issue. You had a real problem because the minerals would taste so bad. You could not drink the water and you would vomit it out. So, not to go there and talk about what that interpretation means or that it's not viable, but just to sort of clear up where Dante and perhaps the Catholic Church may have extended its belief system a little bit too much. So, what you have here is you have this sort of flag that runs along people, this sort of thing that sort of names people. And once that flag is on somebody, then insects come along, they sting. You've got all sorts of mosquitoes and wasps and like these little grubs that come and eat at the feet. And they sort of eat at them. And it's weird because the flag both gives the people identity and also takes away that identity at the same time. This is a form of what we call contrapasso, and this is what we're talking about, how people are getting the fullness of their sin now. Like whatever they do wrong, they really are doing that to the extreme at this point. In other words, it's a sense of counter suffering. The punishment fits to the sin. And that's something that Dante is going to continue this whole time throughout the entire book of the Inferno. We're going to see this happening consistently. Okay, so it's something to look for and probably something that you'll be writing about frequently. Then they come to Archeron and Charon. Archeron is sort of the boundary river to Hades. Charon is the traditional ferryman of Styx. Dante brings him here, and he also makes him a demon. So Charon is there, and he's there to take them across. And at first, he doesn't want to take them across, and then he does because Virgil says, "Hey, you have to. It's ordained." Canto 4, we meet up in Limbo. And so Limbo simply means edge or fringe. And it's the next area that we get to. So Limbo is the place where Dante finds the virtuous pagans. And what we mean by virtuous pagans is the people that were doing good things and that helped the world become a better place, but did not know who Jesus was or according to Christian doctrine. So interestingly, the punishment here is not so obvious. There's no tortures, there's no screaming. The description doesn't say anything horrible about the place. It's Limbo, and this is in fact where Virgil actually resides. And it contains the unbaptized adults and the virtuous pagans. So what is bad here? What is bad here is that the idea of identity of creating a better place is just something that has completely left them. It's something that they no longer have the ability to do. And so all the good things that they created on earth doesn't really matter now because they cannot create anything possible. And then we also have in this canto what we call the harrowing of hell. And this is where we see Virgil mention the Old Testament figures that belonged here at one time. And what happens is shortly after Virgil had come, because Jesus dies around 50, 60 years after Virgil dies, he talks about how he sees this figure come down, and it's Christ, and he gets them. And this is referred to as the harrowing of hell. It's often depicted in medieval art, and Christ comes down, he knocks down the door, he tramples on demons, he holds onto the hands of Adam and Eve and all the other faithful Jews that are lined up behind them, and he rips them through the interior of hell to heaven. Now, Virgil died in 19 BC, so he says that he was, that recent resident when it happened. So this is one sort of an exemption to the rule of the gates. Dante also has an exciting experiences here in Limbo. He talks to, and he's in the company of many of the greatest thinkers, and they call him the sixth, right? They call him the sixth one. He's the new one of them. But the punishment is still there. These men that hope for the highest things on earth, and here, they are unable to obtain that because God is that hope, and He's not there. So they can never fulfill their great need. So that's the harrowing of hell. That's the end of Canto 4, basically, the last idea that we need to get to, and we'll do more in the next video.